the first partner who's joining us is Marietje Brown. She's a sustainability leader at Brambles, which is a world-leading pallet company. And she's helping to turn global timber supply chains into an engine of nature regeneration, really proving that companies can give more to forests than they take. And Sam Jackson is leading climate science and impact at Ecologi, which is a fast-growing platform funding community-rooted nature projects worldwide. And he's really the bridge between the science that we know works and easy-to-use corporate tools. And the reason that I invited them here today is like, together with WeForest, we're trying to evolve the narrative around how we go beyond and centering the conversation really on regeneration, on holistic solution, and nature as the backbone to our climate goals. So the answer here is that it's well north of $500 billion annually. So, and really how I think about this is that this isn't just a funding gap, it's also a risk gap. So every dollar that we delay on investing into nature really becomes future supply chain shocks, disaster losses from climate change, and for businesses as well, missed growth. And that's why the kind of carbon only approach to climate budgets can really fall short. So as we move on to the next slide, why do we say go beyond? So we're not downplaying carbon. It's really about wanting to optimize nature solutions for climate and people, including carbon. So net zero is about cutting emissions down to near zero, offsetting the rest. Nature positive is about restoring ecosystems so that biodiversity, climate, and people all benefit, and carbon is a part of that. And so you'll see here why nature, and from a WeForest perspective, why forest. So 1.6 billion people rely on forests worldwide. That can be for medicine, foods, other things, ecosystem services. And it underpins 55% of global GDP. So no matter who you are on this call, you are touched by this. We're all touched by it. And future generations and their economic prospects will be touched by it as well. 1 million species are at risk. Biodiversity is down over 70%. And for us working within deforestation, 20% of emissions come from deforestation, and actually 60% of this deforestation is driven by causes outside of multinational corporation supply chains. So business is a part of it, but it's really a collective action question. And so this just gets back to the nature as the backbone piece. Nature's delivering carbon, healthy water cycles, fertile soils, and rural jobs, and it's doing that all through one investment vehicle. So as we move on, concretely, there are real reasons why we need to challenge our thinking to go beyond this kind of carbon-only approach. The first is that there will be, based on current projection, carbon credit constraints. So by 2050, it's projected that there's going to be a significant supply gap, particularly for those high quality credits that companies are going to be looking for who have signed up to their net zero pledges and that last bit of offsetting that I talked about before. The second is beyond value chain mitigation. So even SBTI right now is urging investment in credible nature-based solutions beyond value chains. So this could be accounting for historical emissions and moving towards net positive rather than just net neutral solutions. And the third piece is urgency. So we hear this all the time when we talk about climate, but it's also true about nature, and it's also true about people when it comes to development. We can't wait. And nature conservation and restoration is the quickest way to meet our common goals, such as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So now I want to go ahead and move into speaking with Marietje and speaking with Sam. And what we had talked about when we sent out this webinar and what we really wanted to deliver is just real world examples, real world tools, solutions for companies and corporations and all of you who've joined us on what it looks like to really make nature the backbone of your climate solutions. And so I want to hear from our panelists how this works in purpose. So I'll go ahead and I'll give it over to Marietje first. Each of them are going to share a kind of a 5-minute snapshot on what nature positive strategy looks like. So Marietje, I'll hand it over to you to talk about your incredible work at Brambles.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Dave. It's such a pleasure to be here today speaking on this topic. And I think your introduction really set up the conversation in the best possible way. So we understand the intersect of people and nature, the intersect of business and nature, the intersect of business and people a little bit better after the start of this conversation. And that's really where we need to start with that focus area. So looking a little bit at the practical example of Brambles, I think it's a good place to start in explaining our viewpoint on what a nature positive strategy truly is. So if we think about Brambles and the work that we do, most of you will know us through our main brand, CHEP, where we are predominantly an asset pooling company. So the crates, pallets, containers that float around the global supply chain, ensuring that our supply chains function optimally. We have around 500 million of those globally, and we take great care of them to ensure that we can use and reuse them for many, many years. And that's the backbone of CHEP, the backbone of Brambles. And you can see within this business model, there's a definitive focus on the circular economy. So that's the first part of the Brambles story. Brambles as a company is privileged to be born circular, like one of my colleagues says. So that's the starting point for us to say the circular economy is where we operate. Circular economy is how we serve our customers. The circular economy is how we deal with our suppliers. That's our narrative, that's our value chain. So for us to now say, okay, what is the next step? How do we go beyond just our business model and just circularity? Then very natural next step for us is to step into nature positivity. And I get very excited when companies and organizations use the word positive, because already then you can see the commitment to go beyond just what is expected and to actually say, here we are committing to something where we are aiming to put more back in than what we take out. So when we bring those two words together and we say nature positivity, the commitment is to put more back into nature than what we extract. And for a company that has hundreds of millions of timber pallets globally that we own and operate, that commitment sits predominantly within the forest. So you can see why WeForest is such a critical partner for us in this strategy. So thinking about nature positivity within that aspect, one of the key things that we know we need to understand and work on and analyze is the entire value chain and how nature interacts with our business directly, with our suppliers, with our customers. So for us, like I mentioned, a lot of that goes back to the forest and then how we implement projects around those areas to ensure that we put more back into nature. And in the same breath, that we start talking about communities as well. We cannot divorce people and nature, and we cannot divorce community upliftment and resilience from the work that we do from a natural perspective. So that for us is what a nature positive strategy means: understanding your value chain, understanding your suppliers, your customers, understanding your own needs, and then starting that focus upstream to see where your resources come from and how you impact within that area from a nature and communities perspective. Thanks so much, Dave.
Thank you, Marietje. I really appreciate that. I love your point about kind of being born a circular company and also moving to the positive piece of things. I think that's really kind of the foundation of going beyond. We've been stuck in like not doing more bad than we do good, but you're really talking about doing good and starting from a place of positivity. Investing more than you take. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to talk about today. So thank you for that. Sam, would you like to go ahead and also talk about Ecology's work, and how you fit into this picture and your thinking around nature positivity and going beyond?
For sure. Thanks, Dave. And as Marietje said, it's a real pleasure to join you. So thank you for having me. Um, I actually think that that summary was fantastic. I think it's very aligned to the sort of thinking that we have at Ecologi. For anyone who doesn't know Ecologi, so we are a B2B climate tech platform, and we support businesses to go on the climate journey. So from all the way at the beginning to measuring emissions and getting to grips with emissions to start with, all the way through to the other end of the journey where nature projects comes in and carbon dioxide removal projects and things like that comes in. That's where we sit, and we help businesses, especially historically smaller businesses that don't know how to do this kind of thing. We handhold through that journey to help businesses support amazing climate work. And I think the first thing I'd say, I mean, as I say, I think Marietje's introduction was spectacular. I could have almost could have come out of my mouth as well. But I think that what I would add is just that so much of what we see at Ecologi is trying to update people's way of thinking about nature and the way that it interacts with their business and the way that it interacts with climate change. Because even in the way that we try to solve these problems, sometimes we turn them into discrete problems rather than interconnected problems. And the climate problem is also a nature problem, and vice versa. No business exists in a vacuum. No business can exist without a foundation provided by nature, whether that be as trivial as the kind of premises that you have, or all the way up your value chain, your supply chain, or all the way down to your end of life of your products. We can be very tempted to feel like a business can exist on its own in a vacuum floating through space without the systems and the support networks that ecosystems and nature provides. And so much of the work that I do at Ecologi is certainly recently has been helping to kind of make that mindset shift happen, help us to understand that nature is the foundation. And once we have that kind of understanding and that kind of high level grip on the science of these challenges, then we can start to go, okay, well, how does this apply to our business? And exactly as Marietje says, then you can start to think about what's our supply chain? Who are we? What are we trying to do as a business? Where do we fit into this all? And a second strand I'd just throw in there as well, and I think we'll probably come and talk about this a little bit later. I really like that idea of the positivity piece. I think not just from a kind of perspective of regenerative, producing regenerative impacts as opposed to just negating the negative ones, but also in a slightly more abstract sense. There's all this research that has shown us that positive climate messaging delivers action in ways that negative climate messaging does not. And just by way of connotation, if we can feel that we're coming together to move forward, I think that's a more inspiring message to build upon and to build something nature positive out of. And so I think that nature positivity for me, certainly in the abstract, also contains that element of the collaborative, working in partnership, coming together, moving forward together and solving a big problem together. And again, we've worked with WeForest for a few years now. And so for us, having partners that understand that and working collaboratively with peers and partners, and in some cases, friendly competitors to move the dial on this big problem that we're all trying to solve, that to me is where you find the positivity piece.
Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate that. Also want to thank Sam because he's actually on holiday and he's still joining us. So special shout out. I really appreciate that. Yes, and I think today another thing that I would like people and panelists to come away with, and I'll be interested to hear people's thoughts and questions on this as well. But that, this you talked about kind of putting things into discrete boxes, and how it's actually much more effective when we don't think about it that way, even though it's simpler. Everybody likes to put things into simple boxes. And then I think the second thing of that you touched on that I really connected with is in that same vein, partnerships, because this is complicated and because things are interconnected. Nobody is going to be doing this on their own. None of us. We need to be building these partnerships and cross-sector partnerships to really deliver on these huge common goals that we have. So I really appreciate that, Sam. Thanks for setting that up nicely. Before we move into the kind of questions that I have prepared for Marietje and Sam, I just wanted to move on to the next slide, Audrey, and just talk about go beyond as kind of cutting some of these risks as well. So when we go beyond and where we think of nature and people and climate as a nexus and as an intersection, which Marietje talked about, that's when we can really think about the long-term implications of this for people and business. And so that unifying thread is not just simply doing the right thing, but nature pays off for business on these three kind of risk fronts. So on the mitigation front, it's cost effective for long-term climate mitigation. On the adaptation front, up to 4 times return on investment in avoided disaster losses when we think about the adaptation that people and businesses will need, because we've already overshot so many of our targets when it comes to climate. Just an example of that can be soil stabilization. So for example, in one of our projects in Malawi, there was Cyclone Freddy, and the areas around Mount Mulanje where we work that were still forested, that hadn't been deforested, didn't have landslides, which saved thousands of lives, a huge amount of infrastructure, and the economic viability of those communities. The third piece here is economic growth. So when we think about nature and climate together, as well as people, there's potentially trillions in new value and millions of new jobs. So this is where focused future companies can come in and think about nature investments for the future of their companies. So our next panel discussions are really going to dig into the specific levers that companies can pull to capture that upside. So we'll go ahead and move into some questions now. And my first question here is, with so many companies still laser focused on carbon, how do you go beyond by solving the climate and nature crisis together?
Shall I jump in?
Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks, Dave. It's a big question to start off. I mean, I think part of the reason why everybody's focused on carbon up to now is because that's where a lot of the infrastructure, the architecture of corporate sustainability currently is. It's relatively easy in comparison to setting nature targets to set emissions targets or measure emissions in the first place than to measure nature impacts. Because a lot of the nature frameworks that exist are relatively nascent, are coming through or being updated and developed as we speak in relation to the global biodiversity framework, for example. But one of the developments, and I think you touched on it in the introductory slides, is just this concept of beyond value chain mitigation, which is in relation to this topic, it's where ecology most squarely sits. And one of the things that we've been working on with that is trying to, again, develop a mindset shift from a business thinking, oh, I've offset my footprint and I've paid somebody to plant some trees for me, move away from that kind of mindset into a, well, here's what we have done to contribute holistically to climate, nature, and people. And so what that really means for us in the early days, what that meant for us was all in the kind of project and partner selection. You know, whilst on the demand side, the business might think, well, I'm paying somebody to plant some trees or whatever it is, or some carbon credits or whatever. We just have to make sure that the work that's getting done is really holistic, and of course that's what we've been doing. However, over the past sort of year or so, a couple of years now, we would really like to see businesses understanding it on that next level and kind of going, actually, it's not about that. It's not about just offsetting a carbon footprint or whatever. And really, it never has been, actually. What it's actually about is contributing to bettering people's lives, allowing people sustainable livelihoods, adaptation, I think we talked about as well. In fact, I was in Mozambique visiting a mangroves project just after Hurricane Freddy went through, and the same thing is true there, right? You know, mangroves are the kind of quintessential sort of flagship restoration project for coastal communities because of the resilience they provide against storm surges. So it's starting to see things in those holistic ways. And what we've been doing at Ecologi is trying to build things that are going to help businesses to do that. So we recently introduced impact funds. So rather than paying to plant trees, you can contribute to a forest and landscape restoration fund. And all the things, all the components that go into restoring landscapes, whether that be afforestation or social fencing or real fencing or assisted natural regeneration, biodiversity, you name it, all those kinds of things contribute holistically. And that way, we're just trying to turn the dial very slightly so businesses start to understand that there is more to it than carbon, and there's also more to it than some of the things that they've been thinking about with regards to nature as well. And hopefully, because there's a lot of overlap between the kind of carbon world and the nature world and the people world, hopefully we can start to tell that story in a holistic level rather than splitting it into different categories.
That's great, Sam. Yeah, I think I'd love Marietje also to come in here, because I think, Sam, you're working directly with businesses, trying to change some of the narratives and paint a picture, I think, for businesses about what this could look like. And I think, Marietje, your perspective at Brambles, I mean, Brambles just this year was awarded, I think, one of the top sustainable companies in the world, an award. And so you're really living this out as well. And I'm wondering if you could kind of take this from inside the company perspective, and how you would answer this question.
Yeah, thanks, David. So speaking more broadly on the private sector in general, I think what we see is there's a tendency for change to happen quite slowly within this space. So it's taken us as sustainability professionals a very long time to get the private sector to understand carbon. And arguably, not the entire private sector understands carbon at this point in time. There's still a road to go there. And already here we are talking about the next thing, as we should be. But so there's definitely a tendency now to say, well, we've just sort of gotten on top of carbon. We've just started to understand the direct impact that climate change has on us, as we're seeing factories flooded, as we're seeing people's lives disrupted. Now it's real and it's here, and it's making more sense to someone that previously may have not seen the true effects of the climate crisis, and therefore the need to address carbon. So that's the first thing that we need to understand, is that the private sector came a long way, and now there's a tendency to want to address this first before moving on to the next thing. And as Sam pointed out, what we need to here understand is that this is a nexus. This is two sides of the same coin. Carbon feeds into your nature strategy. Carbon is a part of the work that you do within nature. So that's now the level of education that we need to bring to the table, and the conversations, the hard conversations that we need to have within the private sector to say, okay, carbon is fantastic. It's a great kickoff point, and we're really glad that this is happening. However, this is one part, one symptom, one piece of a greater strategy if we want to ensure that we get ahead of the next crisis. Now, the nature crisis is a lot more abstract, a lot more esoteric than the climate crisis. It is very difficult for someone around a boardroom to necessarily understand that species destruction within Africa is something that you should be concerned about. Climate change, global impacts, global risks, I think that's still a little bit easier to communicate and to understand. But now we need to take that to the next level and work on that understanding. And it's not as simple to put financial figures to that either. So we need to find new ways of communicating this and be very adamant in that educational piece to ensure that we bring everybody along for the journey. Carbon, yes, critical, but it's one piece of your strategy going forward. And that's how we need to address this, to say now we need to talk about nature and people in the same breath. And part of that journey is the carbon work that you have been executing on up until now. Thanks, Dave.
That's super, Marietje. And I think that leads really nicely into the next question, which is, as people have gotten more comfortable with carbon, and that's where we've started off, we often see that as the headline metric. But I've also been hearing recently people talking about carbon reframed as a co-benefit of nature. So in the same way that we think about livelihoods with rural communities, for example, as a co-benefit of nature or carbon projects. So from Brambles supply chain innovations, to Ecologi's restoration and offset projects, how are you both kind of rethinking the role of carbon within broader goals, specifically like biodiversity, water access, community resilience?
So I'll jump in there, Dave. So here I think the most pertinent thing for me to bring is a real life example of the work that
That'd
we're
be great.
doing at the moment. So Brambles is in the unique situation where we own 18 timber farms through our brand CHEP South Africa, and that's where I'm based. So I'm based in Durban, South Africa, about 3 hours away from our 18 timber farms and sawmill, which is in the southern Drakensberg area, part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this is a very specific opportunity for us to say, okay, here we have vertical integration, and here we have an opportunity to truly be a part of the landscape approach to regeneration within this area. So we're leading around our timber farms within this space. And everything that you have here on the screen, speaking of biodiversity, of water access, and community resilience, is the areas that we have targeted here. So we work with some truly valued partners within this space to ensure that we can connect people to water that have never been connected to water before, to ensure that we can firstly understand the biodiversity that is present within the area and then put the plans in place to protect and conserve that going forward. It is important that we also understand the community's lived experience around this extremely rural area, and what it is that the community needs to rely on out of nature and from the local business in order for them to thrive, and also gain value from the work that's happening here. So this for me is a very specific example of how we say, okay, we understand the value chain, we understand where our resources come from, we understand our direct reliance on this part of nature here, and how we say, okay, yes, we're safeguarding this, but we're also ensuring that that positivity of the strategy is the lived experience here. And if Brambles was not operating within this area, that nature would be worse off, that people would be worse off. They are actually better off because we operate within this area. And that for us is the ultimate test of nature positivity, and people positivity within that area. And here is a small example of that happening in real life, right at the top of our value chain, and the value that we can see there, how we can track the impacts. So one example from that, the trigger actually for this project was the community that neighbors our timber farms did not have access to water. And so we set a target to connect 1,000 people to water, and we exceeded that target. So we've connected 1,144 people to water. And the reason that that's capped so specifically is because that is the entire community. So the entire community now has access to water. And here we can see the direct impact of people no longer needing to rely on dirty water shared with herds of cattle, etc., but rather being able to open a tap and have reliable water all year round. And this is the work that's being done. And as a result of that, there's also better carbon sinks in the area. So as soon as you flip the narrative and you say, okay, we're working for nature and people, then one of those key levers, one of those key outcomes will naturally be a better management of carbon within the area. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Marietje. And Sam, what would be, as you're advising corporations, what would your kind of answer or thought process or framework be here?
Well, I mean, one of the phrases that I use quite a lot is "it's the other way up," and I think this is a great application of that. In the carbon world, in particular, the voluntary carbon market, everything that isn't carbon gets demoted to co-benefits, and so this is quite a good way of turning it just totally the other way up and kind of going, well, what if carbon was the co-benefit, and what if actually we were doing it for all the other reasons? And I think that's one of the ways that I try to help our businesses to kind of understand that. I think as Marietje said, like, carbon is critical, but it's only a small component of the benefit of some of these projects and programs. I use the example of improved cooking stoves, which are their own project type in the voluntary carbon market, but they also feature very heavily in more holistic restoration programs because they reduce pressure on forest. A lot of traditional cooking methods, for example, are placing deforestation pressure on primary forest. And so, but saying that, in the voluntary carbon market, some of the methodologies for improved cook stoves leave opportunity for miscalculation of the anticipated carbon benefit, which means that often on the demand side in the carbon market, people don't want to buy those carbon credits because they don't think they're worth a full carbon credit. If you turn it the other way up, you go, well, is this not worth funding anyway? Are these solutions not improving people's lives and reducing pressure on forests? And, aside from reducing household pollution, which they do, allowing primarily women in households in some of the poorer countries in the world to gain more time to take the kids to school or money to send their kids to school or whatever it is that not worth doing anyway? Is that not worth funding anyway? And so if you kind of take carbon out of the equation, often you can find, you can kind of zoom out a little bit and kind of think about where is the actual impact of this project coming from. And very often it is to be found in the people and nature kind of buckets. And so I find as well that that's another way that we kind of use to explain that there is more to this than just the carbon side. Something else we've always done at Ecologi as well is we split sort of philanthropically funded projects and carbon market funded projects just straight down the middle. We've never associated the two. We've never kind of used holistic or philanthropic projects to try and do back of the napkin calculations about carbon. None of that. It's sort of two separate things. And actually, very conveniently, in the Beyond Value Chain guidance from the SBTI that came out a couple of years ago or last year, they separate those two sort of things into goal 1 and goal 2. Goal 1 is kind of ex post mitigation outcomes, voluntary carbon market. Goal 2 can be slightly harder to quantify, slightly more abstract, but nevertheless critical, really important. And that's where some of the kind of more nebulous metrics can come from, and the more discrete kind of capital E environmental and social benefit metrics can come into it. Things like access to water and improvement in hydrology, species provenance, and things like this.
Super. Thanks, Sam. Marietje, the next question is for you. I'm wondering, what's the role of partnerships in achieving your sustainability goals? And which partnerships do you feel like have been most effective, and why?
Fantastic question, Dave. So partnerships really underpin how you achieve your sustainability strategy. I do believe that, collaboration, like you mentioned right in the beginning in your introduction, is just so critical in how we address sustainability, carbon, nature positivity, community resilience, etc. It's not a journey that anybody should attempt to do by themselves, because then you're setting yourself up for either a very limited impact or for failure. So absolutely, partnerships is so critical. And obviously we are here because WeForest is one of our key partners, and we also have other partnerships like that, where we partner with trusted NGOs that are experts on the ground and can guide us in the correct way of working within these spaces. So one of the key ways that we believe partnerships are truly successful within this space is by acknowledging the experts in the room. So, for example, if I take the WeForest relationship, we don't come to WeForest and say, hey, Dave, we want to plant trees in this region because it's going to look really good for brambles. We come to WeForest and say, hey, Dave, we believe in what you're doing. We believe in reshaping timber markets, and we believe in the value of forestry. And then you say to us, okay, well, based off of everything that we've discussed, based off of your strategy and based off of your targets and goals, here are projects that we believe are the way in which we do the best work. Then you don't dictate to your partner. You don't act like you are the expert in the room, and you follow that guidance, because your partner, your trusted partner, the one that you tie your reputation to, the one that helps you to achieve on your strategy is the one who is working on the ground, who understands the local connotation, who has the expert ecologists, who has the long-term strategy beyond just your funding in place to say, okay, this is how we effectively work within this space. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of the private sector is still currently learning, that we should not expect our partnerships to mold around ourselves and our strategies, but we should have a two-way conversation and understand which areas your partner should lead you on, in order to have the most effective work on the ground at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. I think one of the things we had talked about in the beginning was how massive the gap is between what's actually being invested into nature and what's needed. And I think part of what lies in between that gap is that actually local communities, like the ones that you mentioned around your kind of in value chain forests in South Africa, but for us, our communities that we're working alongside and partnering with in Ethiopia and Zambia, etc., it's proven that those local communities are the best people to engage with their forests and their natural resources to conserve them and restore them. And so I think those types of partnerships that really center local communities, and where companies can come in and say, actually, we have a lot to learn here from you, and while still plugging into your sustainability strategy is just it's a really important piece of the puzzle, that I think the word community kind of gets passed around a lot, but we don't actually understand sometimes that they're really the key, and the proven stakeholder who's going to effectuate change. So thank you for bringing that up. I think the next question I want to it's two sides of the same coin, but we had talked about tools. So, and the corporate partners who've joined us today, what are some real tools that can be deployed? So I'm wondering on your side, Marietje, what are the tools that companies can be focusing on within their value chain? And then Sam, for you, what about those nature positive tools and solutions in the beyond value chain piece that you had spoken about before?
So, Dave, at the risk of repeating myself, I have to mention the collaboration and the partnerships again. For me, that is the main tool that we need to focus on. We need to understand our value chain. We need to understand our customer base. We need to understand our inputs and our resources within that. But at the end of the day, we should not be attempting to be the answer at every point across the value chain, but rather engaging with the experts within those spaces. And that for me is the crux of it. So if your strategy is to work upstream, where you're pulling your resources from, which is what we're doing within South Africa at this point in time, then your key tool is a partner on the ground that understands that, can guide you and assist you with the execution there. You're not on the ground at every point. You're not the expert at every point, and you shouldn't try to be. You should still be true to what it is that you're wanting to achieve. You're the sustainability professional. You're the one looking at the strategy. You're the one keeping the strategy close to the business strategy in order to ensure it doesn't lose relevance within the boardroom. And then your best tool is a partner that can help you to execute that on the ground. So we talk a lot about trusted partners, and we talk a lot about value-added philanthropy, which effectively means looking at solutions through different layers. So we're not saying, we're only addressing carbon. We're saying carbon goes with water, it goes with people, goes with nature, it goes with the value chain, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how you add value through this specific way of working. So when we work with WeForest, and one of the Brambles targets that we're executing on now at the end of June 2025 is enabling the sustainable growth of 2 trees for every one that we use. Working with WeForest, we can see that this is value-added philanthropy work that we are doing here, because we are not just saying we are restoring 2.7 million trees with WeForest. What we are saying is we are restoring 2.7 million trees with WeForest, which each tree has an impact on the local community. There's impact on how people are economically empowering themselves. There's impact on how the forest overall is recovering within that ecosystem, etc., etc. That's the value-added philanthropy that becomes the key arrow in your quiver when addressing this. And again, it all just comes back to the right collaboration, the right motivation, the right partnership. That's how you get the experts in the room, and that's how you get the impact stats on paper at the end of the day.
Super, Marietje. And Sam, from a beyond value chain standpoint, you know, how would you address this?
Well, firstly, I have to say I completely agree on the partnerships front. I think something that I see far too often is people trying to solve everything on their own, and that isn't going to be how we solve this problem. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more. This idea of bringing people together and listening to the people who know more than you do in their own field is such an important grounding. By way of tools, I mean, I think from our perspective, there are, on the one hand, I think in nature recovery in general, there are too few tools that are relevant for business or helpful for businesses to use. On the other hand, I think there are so many things out there that are sort of semi-helpful to businesses that it can be really difficult to choose where to start. I think the first thing that any business needs to do is to kind of familiarize themselves with the kind of high-level understanding of where we are at in biodiversity. I usually start with things like the Global Biodiversity Framework and the goals set within that. The Sustainable Development Goals is another very widely used framework for that purpose. I think it's worth saying as well with either of those frameworks to dive into the goals and indicators, not just the targets and indicators, not just the goals themselves, because that's actually where the substantive component is that you can then use in your business to work out what you want to do about your impact on nature. And then something else that we make use of quite a lot is kind of remote sensing. You know, albeit on occasion we will go to visit projects that we support for partner building and learning and these kinds of things. We don't want to fly around the world all the time. And moreover, people in country have got jobs to do that mean they don't need to kind of be a tour guide to us from the other side of the world. And so remote sensing plays a huge part, because what we can do is we can, as well as receiving stories from on the ground, from the people doing the work, the experts, we can use tools like Restore or GIS platforms and things like this. We use one called Earthblocks, which is a no-code solution, to get the high-level picture, high level, but also relatively quant picture of how is an area being restored over time. What's the vegetation change happening over time on a kind of quant basis. And so once you've kind of established the strategy and rooted that in these high-level frameworks from the UN, and you started working within your business and with the partners that you've selected to go and do the groundwork, you can then, despite the fact that you're kind of one step removed, you can still kind of keep tabs over time using tools like that. There's another one, Restoration Scope, which is fantastic, that I saw used the other day. Again, kind of really high-level satellite imagery, but also allows you to zoom into more or less individual level, household level, livelihood supported and things like this as well. And those kind of tools as a donor, as a contributor, I think are really, really helpful to build on the partnerships that you need to have in this kind of space.
Super. Well, thank you both so much for digging into some of those questions. I want to take some questions from people who've written in. I think the first one is a good one to start with, and it's one that we haven't talked about yet. So the question is, what role will or do consumers play in driving demand for beyond net zero products and services?
It's a good question.
Sam, you want to take that?
I can start us off. Yeah, it's a good question. First things first, and I know I'm sounding a bit like a broken record. I almost want to examine our use of the word consumer. because I think it kind of presupposes that the only thing we're here to do is consume. And I think obviously that's a huge part of the problem with regards to the nature crisis. Having said that, that's not a very practical answer. So to give a practical answer as well, I think really important. Fundamentally, I think one of the reasons why we have to make the economic case to restore nature is because the behavior of the businesses that we are talking about is governed by what goes on in the boardroom. And the language of the boardroom is primarily an economic one, a financial one. And so that's why it remains the case that you can, as a consumer, as a citizen, as a person, engaging in the economy, one of the most effective, or two of the most effective things you can do are vote with your wallet and vote with your vote. Who you're voting for and who you're giving your money to are really, really critical. And so when it comes to using that lever to incentivize businesses to do nature positive work, I do think it's really important. I think it's important because aside from these arguments that we've made about integrating it with the business strategy, one of the kind of micro level implementations of that is, well, what are the people who buy our products wanting us to do? And I think a lot of boardrooms, even if they're still on the kind of finance economic case only side of things, that's a wedge issue that we can use and kind of say, well, actually, the consumers want to see us do this, and they will go somewhere else if we don't. And that's a really powerful lever. Just by way of one very quick example, I know we're running out of time. Something amazing that we see with organizations we work with BAFTA, for example, and we see industries doing amazing climate and nature work and kind of using that as a competitive tool. So that the BAFTA Albert scheme, for example, is a sustainability scheme for television and film production in the UK. It becomes a kind of quasi-compliance tool, because if you aren't doing the scheme and you aren't kind of showing a label that yes, we're controlling our emissions and we're contributing to nature, then you lose a competitive edge. And again, that's kind of feeds into that boardroom finance and economics kind of side of things. And so again, it's kind of, how do we pull those kind of little levers that are going to actually drive the dial at the other end? Marietje, I don't know if you had more to add on that one.
Yeah, maybe Sam, if I could just jump in quickly there. So I see the value of pushing the consumer to ensure that we get them voting with their spending habits, etc. as well. But as a B2B company, which is the place that Brambles plays in, I also want to ensure that we don't overly rely on it. It should never be the consumer's responsibility to tell business what to do. Business must push itself further. Business must be accountable, and not sit back reactively and say, well, no one's really asking the question, because that's a cop-out. So as much as we need to educate the consumer and ensure that they're in a position where they can play into the correct type of economics that we want to see, we also need to be self-reliant and ensure that we are having the difficult conversations behind closed doors and ensuring that we get the job done, and not rely on somebody else to poke and say, hey, please do better.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Excellent. Well, one last question. I think that's all we've got time for. But someone asked, your points about positivity and the power of positive messages are much appreciated. But can businesses whose core business models are nature negative, meaning their existence depends on taking from nature, ever become positive or regenerative? Marietje, I think actually Brambles is a great example of something that could be seen without digging into things as potentially an extractive business, when you've changed that into a regenerative business. So maybe if you have another example, I know we've talked in the past about different projects outside of South Africa, but if you have maybe one other example of how this truly has become switched from nature negative to a regenerative business model.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. So again, if you think about our business model, we need timber to make pallets, right? So yes, we use them for about 10 years thereafter, ensure that we minimize any environmental impacts, not just for ourselves, but for our customers. But at the beginning, we still need to extract timber. So what are we doing in order to ensure that we have a positive impact within that space as well? So we have one really nice example that I want to highlight here, which is in Tabasco in Mexico. And what we found there is brownfields projects hugely desertified. So in other words, previously forested or previously planted areas that had been desertified for more than a decade, so for a really long time. And the communities that had previously relied on that land truly suffering in poverty. And so again, with a local partner on the ground leading us in how we work within this space and relying on their expertise and their community connections on the ground, Brambles has stepped in and is actually doing a lot of work to reverse that desertification and creating timber plantations within this space that have positive impacts on nature and, of course, very positive impacts on the local community. So this is a real life example of how an area that had effectively been written off and people had given up, people who had lived in the place for generations and whose great grandfather had run a timber farm there and had since lost everything to this desertification and fallen into severe poverty. Being able to uplift them, being able to uplift the natural world there as well. So the short answer is that it can be done. It's about finding the right partners, finding the right expertise, taking a risk on innovation, and ensuring that we step into a space that perhaps is not the easiest, not the most comfortable, but that we know we can make a true difference in.
Thanks so much, Marietje. I think that's a great example and something that's really positive to end on. Taking a place that was economically unviable before and using your business with a nature positive and regenerative focus to bring that area back to life. Great for Brambles, but also great for those communities and that ecosystem. So thanks so much for sharing the specifics of that. We are at time, so I want to go ahead and close us out. So in terms of when I had talked about at kind of the beginning of the top of the conversation, I talked about bringing Marietje and Sam on as great thought partners and people who are really wanting to evolve and expand this conversation, a both and solution to this type of things. And so we want to continue doing that also at WeForest. So over the next few months, we'll engage on some different fronts. We've got some success stories coming out over the course of the summer because we know it tends to be a bit quiet with people out on vacation, but you can still read some great stories about what Go Beyond looks like. We'll also be working on a white paper that's going to be coming out later this fall on what this means to us and getting concrete. And in the autumn and fall, we're also going to be at some events. And so here we'd really love to see you if you're going to be there as well, bringing like-minded partners together to really push this kind of Go Beyond agenda for people, nature, and climate.